The winter of 1940 lay heavy upon the North Sea. Icy winds rolled off the Norwegian coast, turning the waters steel grey. To the neutral eyes of Scandinavia, this was just another storm season. But hidden behind the freezing fog was a ship carrying a secret that would soon ignite one of the most dramatic maritime confrontations of the entire Second World War. Her name was Altmark, a German fleet tanker belonging to the Kriegsmarine. Outwardly, she was a supply ship, a floating warehouse for fuel and provisions. In truth, she was something far darker, a prison on the move. Deep within her steel hull, behind sealed compartments, lay nearly 300 British sailors captured months earlier by the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. When the Graf Spee was cornered off Montevideo in December 1939 and scuttled to avoid surrender, its prisoners had been quietly transferred to Altmark. Now that lonely tanker was steaming northward from South America, attempting to slip home through the icy Norwegian fjords. Her captain, Heinrich Dow, was under orders from Berlin to avoid confrontation at all costs. The Altmark was not a warship. She carried no heavy guns, but her cargo, those living captives, made her one of the most hunted vessels on Earth. For Britain, the loss of the Graf Spee had been a triumph, yet the thought of hundreds of its sailors still trapped aboard a supply ship haunted the Admiralty. Intelligence from the Norwegian coast hinted that a German vessel was hugging neutral waters, using Norway's neutrality as a shield. British codebreakers soon connected the dots. The Altmark was trying to sneak home under the cover of international law. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, saw an opportunity and a moral duty to strike. Throughout January and early February 1940, British reconnaissance aircraft scoured the coastlines of Norway, Denmark, and the Skagerrak. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the German Naval High Command wrestled with growing anxiety. The British blockade had strangled trade routes, and the Altmark's safe return was vital. Losing her would mean losing not just supplies, but also propaganda value. The promise that captured British sailors could be used as bargaining chips. Captain Dow faced a dilemma that would define the rest of his life. Norway was officially neutral. Its government, fearful of provoking either side, insisted that any belligerent warship passing through its territorial waters must do so unarmed and without prisoners. Dow's ship violated both conditions. Yet to sail outside Norwegian protection meant exposure to British destroyers prowling just beyond the 3-mile limit. He chose to gamble on legality and secrecy, hoping the thin veneer of neutrality would hold. On 14 February 1940, the Altmark entered Norwegian waters near Trondheim. Norwegian patrol vessels intercepted her, boarded her briefly, and, after a perfunctory inspection, allowed her to continue southward. They found no obvious weapons, no visible prisoners. The British sailors below decks had been ordered to silence. Their air was rationed. Their lights were dimmed. German guards warned that any shout or signal could lead to immediate shooting, so the prisoners waited in suffocating silence while their ships slid past the fjord patrols. Word of this inspection reached the Admiralty within hours. Churchill exploded with fury. Norway, he argued, had been duped, or worse, complicit. He issued a direct order to intercept the Altmark. Neutrality be damned. The Royal Navy would not allow British subjects to be smuggled through neutral waters like contraband. That night, destroyers of the 4th Destroyer Flotilla steamed north from Scapa Flow under the command of Captain Philip Vian aboard HMS Cossack. Their mission was officially reconnaissance, but every sailor aboard knew the truth. This was a rescue. Meanwhile, inside the Altmark, conditions deteriorated. Frost coated the steel bulkheads. Condensation dripped onto the prisoners' hammocks. They could hear the hum of the ship's engines and the distant echo of orders shouted in German. Rumors spread through the cramped holes. Rumors of rescue, of approaching destroyers, but also of despair. A few men scratched messages into tin plates, hoping they might survive even if they did not. Captain Dow kept his eyes on the chart. His chosen route hugged the fjords, weaving through narrow inlets where towering cliffs masked radar signals. Each bend brought another Norwegian escort vessel verifying his papers. Each inspection, though brief, tightened the tension. The Germans knew the British were closing in. Late on 16th February 1940, the Altmark entered Jossingfjord, a remote inlet near Egersund. snow drifted gently from the darkening sky, muffling the sound of engines. Norwegian patrol vessels intercepted her inside, intending to provide safe harbor until daylight. It was there, hidden beneath icy cliffs, that Captain Vian and HMS Cossack finally caught sight of their target. Vian faced his own moral crisis. To attack within neutral waters would violate international law and risk dragging Norway into war. But the prisoners' lives, Churchill's direct orders, and British honor all demanded action. Standing on the destroyer's bridge, wrapped in a greatcoat against the wind, Vian weighed legality against humanity. He chose humanity. At 10:20 p.m., HMS Cossack turned toward the fjord entrance. Its searchlights stabbed through the darkness, illuminating the grey hull of Altmark. Over the radio, Vian signaled the Norwegian escorts, demanding permission to board the German ship to verify claims of British prisoners. The Norwegians hesitated, caught between neutrality and conscience. "We have examined her already," they replied. "There are no prisoners on board." Vian didn't believe them. "Then," he radioed back, "we are going in to see for ourselves." The destroyer advanced at full speed, slicing through the thin ice crust on the fjord. Norwegian vessels flashed warning lights, but did not fire. Captain Dow ordered his engines to full ahead, trying to flee deeper into the fjord. But there was nowhere left to run. The Cossacks swung alongside and dropped boarding parties, armed with revolvers, cutlasses and flashlights. As British sailors clambered over the tanker's slippery hull, German crewmen shouted and fired pistols in panic. Echoes bounced off the cliffs, amplified by the confined space. Hand-to-hand scuffles erupted on deck. A German guard attempted to close the hatch leading below. A British sailor, Ensign Terry, swung a rifle butt into the man's shoulder and kicked the hatch open. From below, faint voices cried out in English. "We're down here, down here." Those words, after months of silence, cut through the chaos like a church bell. British boarders surged into the passageway, flashlights darting through the gloom. They reached a locked bulkhead. Beyond it they could hear pounding fists. One sailor pulled a crowbar from his belt and jammed it into the seam. Metal groaned. The door burst inward. What met their eyes was unforgettable. Dozens of gaunt men blinking into the beam of light, some weeping, some laughing, too weak even to stand. One voice, barely audible, asked, "Are you English?" "Aye, and the Navy's come to take you home," the reply came. Above deck, the brief skirmish ended. 7 German sailors lay wounded, 1 was dead. The Cossacks' loudspeaker blared across the fjord with Vian's now famous announcement. "The Navy's here! You're free now!" Cheers erupted from below, echoing through the steel hull and out into the icy night. By dawn, the Altmark lay secured under British control. Her freed prisoners, 299 of them, were ferried to the Cossack, given hot tea and blankets, and soon heading back towards the open sea. The rescue had taken less than 15 minutes, but would reverberate across Europe for months. In London, Churchill received the news with satisfaction bordering on delight. "A fine, gallant action," he told Parliament, "one that will warm every English heart." For him, the Altmark incident was proof that British resolve still burned bright, even in the war's darkest winter. In Berlin, rage exploded. The German press called it piracy. The Nazi Foreign Office accused Britain of murdering sailors under the protection of neutral Norway. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and severe, but the moral symbolism was greater still. The Altmark incident was more than a daring rescue. It was a glimpse into the coming struggle for Scandinavia, a sign that neutrality could no longer shield any nation from the widening war.
Chapter 2. The Shock Waves Across Europe, Hitler's Fury, and the Shattered Neutrality. When dawn broke over the Norwegian coast on February 17, 1940, the fjords lay silent again, blanketed in fog. The sound of engines had faded, the gunfire echoes swallowed by snow, but the ripples from that single night in Jossing Fjord were already racing outward, spreading from Oslo to London, from Berlin to the far reaches of occupied Europe. The rescue of the British prisoners from the Altmark was more than an isolated naval encounter. It was an explosion that tore a hole through the fragile fabric of European neutrality. In Berlin, the news arrived like a thunderclap. The Kriegsmarine's communications officer burst into the Reich Chancellery with a telegram. Altmark boarded by British destroyer inside Norwegian waters. Prisoners freed. Casualties on both sides. Adolf Hitler, pacing before a wall map of Scandinavia, froze mid-step. For months, the Führer had been wary of drawing Norway into the war. Germany depended on Norway's ports for the transport of Swedish iron ore, the raw material that fed its tanks, guns, and factories. Any disruption could cripple the Reich's war machine, but now a British warship had violated Norwegian sovereignty and humiliated Germany in full view of the world. Hitler's temper ignited. He slammed his fist onto the table, sending pencils scattering. "So the English think they can do as they please, even in neutral waters?" he shouted. His aides remained motionless, eyes lowered. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander-in-chief of the German Navy, tried to calm the storm. He argued that Norway's failure to enforce its neutrality was the true cause. "Mein Führer, Norway is weak. They allowed the English to operate freely within their fjords. If we do not secure that coastline ourselves, they will use it against us." Those words lodged deep in Hitler's mind. Until that moment, Germany's plans for Scandinavia were tentative, vague proposals on paper. But the Altmark incident transformed hypothetical strategy into urgent necessity. Within days, Hitler summoned his generals and demanded contingency plans for a full-scale invasion. Operation Weserübung, the assault on Denmark and Norway, was born in the fury of that February morning. In London, the mood was entirely different. When the Cossack and her convoy arrived in port carrying the rescued prisoners, crowds gathered along the quays. Wives, parents, and comrades cheered as the freed sailors disembarked, wrapped in blankets, eyes hollow but smiling. Newspapers splashed headlines across the front pages. "Prisoners freed in daring fjord raid. British Navy defeats German pirates." The story electrified a nation still reeling from defeats in Poland and the North Atlantic. For the first time in months, Britain felt victorious. In the Admiralty, Winston Churchill walked briskly into the map room, cigar in hand. "Gentlemen," he said with a grin, "this was a small action but a most heartening one. Let every German tanker tremble in the fjords." His words drew laughter and applause, but behind the levity lay a dangerous awareness. Britain had broken international law. Norway, technically neutral, had protested immediately. Its foreign minister, Halvdan Koht, delivered a formal complaint to the British ambassador, condemning the violation of Norwegian sovereignty. The British government replied with carefully chosen words, expressing regret for the necessity but not apology. The prisoners' rescue, they argued, justified the means. Across the North Sea, Norway found itself in an impossible position. Its people awoke to headlines accusing them of weakness from both sides. British newspapers claimed the Norwegians had turned a blind eye to German deceit. German broadcasts accused them of betraying a friendly nation by failing to protect a German ship. Prime Minister Johan Nygaard's Hold convened an emergency session of his cabinet in Oslo. The ministers debated for hours under the shadow of a single terrible question: how long could neutrality survive when both belligerents treated it as a convenience rather than a principle? Norwegian naval officers, humiliated by their inability to prevent the British incursion, increased patrols. But even as they did, German merchant ships began hugging the coast in greater numbers, testing the limits of Norwegian control. British intelligence noticed the shift. So did the Germans. Both sides now viewed Norway not as neutral territory, but as a chessboard waiting to be seized. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler's anger had cooled into calculation. He summoned Raeder and General Niklaus von Falkenhorst, a veteran of the Polish campaign, to the Reich Chancellery. The meeting was terse. Hitler pointed to the map of Norway, tracing a line from Narvik to Oslo with his finger. "This coast must be ours. No British soldier shall set foot here before the Wehrmacht." Raeder outlined the military logic. Control of Norway would secure access to the Atlantic, protect iron ore shipments from Sweden through Narvik, and deny Britain naval bases along the fjords. Falkenhorst was ordered to prepare invasion plans immediately. When asked how soon they could be ready, he replied, "Within days, my Führer." Hitler nodded. "Then days are what we have." By late February, the Altmark incident had reshaped German strategy entirely. The Wehrmacht began quietly assembling transport ships in northern German ports. Luftwaffe squadrons were redeployed to Denmark. Submarines took up positions near the Norwegian coast. The entire northern theater of Europe was bracing for the storm, born from that one night in Jasing Fjord. In Britain, Churchill understood the same truth from the opposite perspective. The rescue had been a propaganda triumph, yes, but it had also provoked the enemy. He wrote in his diary that the Germans would not let the insult pass unanswered. "We have struck them in a sensitive place," he noted. "I fear we may soon see retaliation in the north." As March unfolded, British intelligence intercepts began to confirm his fears. Radio traffic between Berlin and Oslo spiked. German merchant vessels in Norwegian ports were unloading crates under the guise of commercial trade, crates later revealed to contain weapons and radio equipment. Yet despite these warnings, political caution restrained the Allies. France and Britain hesitated to violate Norway's neutrality again, even as Germany prepared to do so on a far greater scale. For the men who had been rescued from the Altmark, life slowly returned to normal, though few could forget their ordeal. Some were redeployed to escort convoys in the Atlantic, others hospitalized for exhaustion and frostbite. Their stories circulated in naval barracks, tales of whispers in the dark, of the sudden burst of light when the British stormed the ship. The phrase, "the Navy's here," became an unofficial slogan of morale. But beneath the cheers and the relief, darker questions lingered. Had the rescue been worth the risk? What if the violation of Norwegian neutrality pushed a fragile nation straight into Hitler's arms? Churchill brushed such doubts aside at first, calling the operation an act of naval decency. Yet by April, when German warships began appearing off the Norwegian coast, the consequences of that decency would become all too real. In Oslo, diplomats felt the tension tightening around them. Foreign Minister Koht confided to his aides that Norway was a small boat in a storm and the waves are made by giants. His warning proved prophetic. German intelligence agents, operating under commercial cover, had infiltrated key Norwegian ports. They transmitted weather data and shipping schedules to Berlin. Meanwhile, the British Admiralty considered its own contingency plans for occupying Narvik to cut off Germany's iron supply. Each side was now preparing to act, but Germany would strike first. By early April, Operation Weserübung was finalized. 10 days after Hitler's final approval, the invasion would begin simultaneously across Norway and Denmark. The plan called for a lightning assault on Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, Stavanger, Narvik, and Kristiansand. Troops would be landed by warships under the cover of darkness. Airborne units would seize airfields and communication centers. It was audacious, risky, and unprecedented. But Hitler believed it necessary to protect the Reich's lifeline. When historians later traced the origins of the Norway campaign, they found its spark not in Berlin's expansionist plans or in British provocations at large, but in a single phrase recorded in Hitler's meeting notes on February 21st. "The English have shown that Norway cannot protect its neutrality. Therefore, we must protect it with German forces." And so the world moved closer to another escalation. The Altmark incident, once celebrated as a heroic rescue, had become the opening act of a far greater tragedy. Within 2 months, Norway's coastline would burn, its cities would fall, and Europe's northern front would open in blood and fire. But on that cold February morning in 1940, as Captain Dow sat in a German naval cell under interrogation, and Captain Wien returned to applause and medals, neither man could have foreseen that their clash in a silent fjord would tip the balance of strategy, redraw maps, and bring an entire nation into war. Chapter 3. Operation Weserübung. The invasion of Norway begins. The morning of April 9th, 1940, dawned with an eerie calm along the Norwegian coast. Fishing boats dotted the fjords, unaware that beneath the fog, the greatest amphibious invasion in Northern Europe's history was already underway. The sound of engines came first, a low metallic hum rolling over the water. Then shapes began to emerge from the mist, destroyers, cruisers, and transports flying the black, white, and red of the Reich. Germany had come to Norway. Operation Weserübung had begun. In the weeks since the Altmark incident, Hitler had transformed anger into action. He saw Norway not only as vengeance for the British humiliation, but as strategic salvation. Whoever held Norway controlled the North Atlantic approaches and the iron ore lifeline from Sweden. Without it, Germany's war industry would suffocate. The plan was daring to the point of madness, to seize an entire country in one day, using the element of surprise as the ultimate weapon. At 3 a.m., German warships entered the Oslo fjord. On board the heavy cruiser Blücher, officers rehearsed the timetable for the assault on Oslo. The ship carried not just sailors, but hundreds of troops from the 163rd Infantry Division, bureaucrats, and even Gestapo agents meant to secure the Norwegian capital's government buildings. Their confidence
was absolute. After all, Norway was neutral, unprepared, and unsuspecting. But as Blücher advanced into the fjord, the stillness was broken by a flash from the shoreline. At the fortress of Oscarsborg, an aging coastal battery manned by reservists and led by Birger Eriksson spotted the intruders. Unsure whether the approaching ships were friendly, Eriksson hesitated only for a moment before giving a quiet but decisive order. Fire. Two massive 280mm guns roared to life. The first shell struck Blücher's superstructure, igniting fuel and ammunition. The second ripped through her hangar, detonating stored aircraft bombs. Within minutes, the pride of the German fleet was engulfed in flame. Anti-aircraft crews panicked as the inferno spread. At 7:30 a.m., Blücher capsized and sank beneath the fjord, taking over 600 men with her. The loss of Blücher delayed the capture of Oslo for precious hours. Norwegian troops scrambled to defend their capital, while King Haakon VII and his cabinet fled northward, refusing to surrender. German paratroopers landed near Oslo's airfield at Fornebu, meeting fierce resistance. Yet by afternoon, German reinforcements had secured the runway, allowing waves of transport aircraft to land. Despite the early disaster, the invasion pressed on relentlessly. Farther north, in Bergen, Trondheim, and Stavanger, German ships entered harbors under cover of darkness. Some encountered minimal opposition. Others faced confused bursts of coastal artillery fire. At Narvik, the vital port for Swedish iron ore, 10 German destroyers carried 2,000 mountain troops into the harbor. The local Norwegian garrison, caught between duty and disbelief, fired warning shots, but soon found themselves surrounded. Within hours, German flags rose over nearly every major Norwegian port. What astonished observers around the world was not just the audacity of the operation, but its precision. Every assault seemed choreographed to the minute. Airborne forces captured airfields, seaplanes secured fjords, and warships coordinated with ground troops through encrypted radio signals. For the first time, the world saw the full execution of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, not just on land, but across sea and sky. But beneath the triumph, cracks were already forming. The Kriegsmarine had overextended itself. Many of its destroyers and cruisers were damaged or low on fuel. The Navy had gambled everything on a rapid victory. If the British fleet counterattacked swiftly, the entire expedition could be trapped. In London, Churchill, now formally elevated as First Lord of the Admiralty, received the first reports of the invasion with a grim expression. For weeks, British intelligence had warned of German preparations, but the exact timing had eluded them. Now the cables were clear. Norway was under attack from end to end. So they've done it after all, Churchill muttered. By evening, the Royal Navy was already steaming north. Battleships, aircraft carriers, and destroyers left Scapa Flow, bound for the Norwegian coast. British commandos prepared for landings at Narvik and Namsos, hoping to cut off German reinforcements and support Norwegian defenders. But the weather turned brutal. Snowstorms and high seas battered the Allied flotillas. Coordination faltered, and within days, German air superiority over Norway's narrow valleys began to take its toll. In Berlin, the mood shifted from anxiety to exhilaration. Reports of success flooded in. Trondheim captured, Bergen secured, Stavanger airfield operational. Even Oslo, though delayed, had fallen by evening. Hitler, usually cautious after early war surprises, was euphoric. "This," he declared, "is the greatest victory in German naval history." He ordered a special communiqué sent to the troops. "You have shown the world that courage and surprise can overcome all obstacles." But not everyone in Germany shared his confidence. Grand Admiral Raeder, though proud of his navy's daring, knew the cost. The sinking of Blücher and the damage to other ships had crippled nearly a third of his destroyer fleet. "My Führer," he warned quietly, "we have conquered Norway, but at the price of our sea power." Hitler waved the concern aside. "The British will not dare challenge us here. The North is secured." He was wrong. At Narvik, The British Navy struck back with vengeance. On April 10th, the destroyers HMS Hardy and HMS Hunter stormed into the fjord under cover of snow. German ships at anchor never saw them coming. Torpedoes streaked through the freezing water, exploding beneath the hulls of German destroyers. Flames leapt into the night sky as ammunition detonated, but the British had also entered a trap. Ammunition nearly exhausted, and enemy mountain troops firing from the cliffs above. HMS Hardy ran aground, ablaze from bow to stern. Her captain, Bernard Warburton Lee, was killed on the bridge, later posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. 3 days later, British and French troops landed at Narvik, supported by Polish brigades and Norwegian volunteers. It was the first large-scale Allied counteroffensive of the war. For a brief moment, it seemed victory was possible. But that same week, Germany invaded France and the lowlands. With disaster unfolding in Western Europe, the Allies abandoned Norway entirely, evacuating their troops in early June. By the time the last British ship left Norwegian waters, over 5,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or captured. The Norwegians, outmatched and isolated, surrendered on June 10th. King Haakon VII and his government fled to London, where they would lead a government in exile for the remainder of the war. Germany now controlled the entire Norwegian coastline, 1,600 miles of fjords and inlets that gave the Kriegsmarine U-boat bases, airfields, and early warning posts stretching to the Arctic Circle. It was a staggering strategic victory. Yet in hindsight, it was also a costly one. Thousands of German troops were now tied down garrisoning remote settlements, guarding endless coastlines, and maintaining supply lines across perilous seas. What had begun as a swift strike turned into a long, grinding occupation. The irony was bitter. The Altmark incident, born from a moral rescue, had provoked a chain reaction that ended with the subjugation of an entire nation. Churchill later reflected on the paradox in his memoirs. "We saved 300 men from one ship, but by that act, we opened a door that would imprison millions." Still, the invasion of Norway became a symbol of Germany's tactical brilliance and audacity. It demonstrated coordination between air, sea, and land forces on a scale unseen before. It taught the Allies a painful but vital lesson, that the age of slow-moving war was over. From this moment forward, speed and surprise would rule the battlefield. The shadow of Altmark now stretched across Europe. Norway, once a quiet bystander, was transformed into a fortress of the north, a fortress that would host U-boat pens, radar stations, and secret testing sites for the remainder of the war. Hitler called it the Shield of the Reich. The Allies called it the Frozen Front. But as the months passed, that shield would begin to crack. Resistance movements formed in the mountains. British commandos would return under moonlight to sabotage railways, sink ships, and strike at German garrisons. And deep beneath the icy cliffs, a new kind of war, one fought by saboteurs and spies, was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Masters of Illusion. In 1944, the Ghost Army reached the peak of its deception craft. What had started as a small, secret experiment had now become a full-scale operation, moving across France and the Low Countries like a phantom division. By then, they weren't just soldiers. They were illusionists, magicians, sound engineers, and artists performing the most dangerous theater the world had ever seen, one staged with smoke, sound, and shadow. They rolled out hundreds of inflatable Sherman tanks under the pale moonlight, each one painted with details so real that Allied pilots often mistook them for genuine armor. Trucks were covered with fake canvas tops to appear as artillery. In some cases, they even added soldiers' helmets made of papier-mâché to complete the illusion. But these men were not meant to fight. Their ammunition was rubber, and their weapon
was deception. The Ghost Army's greatest tool wasn't just the visuals, it was sound. They recorded the roars of tank engines, the clanking of treads, and the shouted commands of officers, then played them through enormous speakers mounted on jeeps. The recordings could be heard from 15 miles away, fooling German scouts into thinking that an entire armored division was assembling nearby. Every detail was measured: the time between truck convoys, the rhythm of movement, even the chatter of soldiers at imaginary camps. To the Germans, it looked like the Allies were preparing for massive attacks, but in truth, the Ghost Army was covering the movements of real divisions: the 9th Army, the 30th Corps, the 2nd Armored Division, all slipping silently in the opposite direction while the Germans prepared for an assault that would never come. There was art in everything they did. Many of the men were professional artists, illustrators, designers, men like Bill Blass, who would later become a world-famous fashion designer, and Ellsworth Kelly, who would go on to shape modern American art. On the battlefield, these men painted insignias on trucks, created fake unit markings, and forged entire identities for divisions that didn't exist. They called it special effects warfare. To outsiders, it looked absurd: a war fought with rubber tanks and paintbrushes. But for the soldiers who depended on their illusions, it was deadly serious. Every operation had to be perfectly timed. If the enemy discovered the truth too soon, the deception would fail, and hundreds of real soldiers could die. One of the most famous missions took place near the Rhine River. The Germans believed the U.S. 30th Infantry Division was preparing to cross the river near a small town called Wesel, but in reality, the real crossing was planned 20 miles south. The Ghost Army, acting as the 30th, set up fake camps, positioned dummy tanks, and even broadcasted fake radio chatter that mimicked the real division's tone and call signs. It worked. The Germans concentrated their defenses near Wesel, leaving the real crossing point dangerously underdefended. When the actual U.S. forces struck, they met far less resistance than expected. The success saved thousands of lives, all thanks to an army of artists who never fired a shot. Behind every mission was a mix of fear and exhilaration. The men of the Ghost Army operated close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. They joked that their division had the highest mortality risk with the lowest power fire. If they were ever discovered, they had no means to defend themselves, yet most of them volunteered for the job. They saw it as a way to use creativity in the service of survival. In one letter home, Sergeant John Jarvie wrote, "It's strange, really. We make war look real, but we're not supposed to fight it. Sometimes I wonder if that makes us heroes, or just ghosts ourselves." Every night, they inflated their tanks, rolled them into position, and waited for reconnaissance planes to fly overhead. When the planes came, they stood proudly by their fake vehicles, waving and pretending to perform maintenance. The enemy would photograph the massed armor and send the images back to headquarters. The illusion would be complete. But daylight could be deadly. If the wrong person came too close, if a German patrol stumbled upon one of the inflatables, it could unravel the entire deception. So they guarded their secrets with layers of confusion. Some men posed as MPs, directing traffic and spreading false rumors. Others forged paperwork or painted over insignias in a single night. Their stories varied so widely that even other Allied units sometimes believed the Ghost Army was a genuine combat division. The secrecy was that effective. In late 1944, during Operation Viersen, the Ghost Army carried out one of their largest and daring missions. They simulated the movements of the 9th Army to mask its real approach towards the Rhine. The operation lasted 8 days and involved over 1,000 men. Every sound, every movement, every radio message was coordinated with mathematical precision. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead and saw what they expected to see: tanks, supply trucks, artillery, camps. They had no reason to doubt the illusion. Meanwhile, real Allied troops crossed the Rhine unopposed, paving the way for the Allied advance into Germany. When the war finally ended, the Ghost Army faded into obscurity. Their missions remained classified for decades. The world celebrated the paratroopers, the infantry, the tank battalions, but not the artists who had fought with smoke and sound. For years, their story was a secret, even to their families. Yet, among the men who served, there was no bitterness. They knew what they had done. They had turned imagination into a weapon and saved countless lives doing it. Their battlefield wasn't marked by blood, but by illusion, not by destruction, but by creation. The true irony of the Ghost Army is that their greatest victories were invisible. Every success meant that real soldiers never had to fight, never had to die. Their silence, their secrecy, their art, all served one purpose: to deceive death itself. In the years that followed, many of them went on to careers in art, design, and engineering. They carried with them a deep understanding of perception, how to make people believe what they see and hear, and perhaps that's why their legacy feels so haunting. They didn't just trick the enemy, they changed the very nature of warfare. Because in the modern age, victory isn't always about who fires the most bullets. Sometimes it's about who tells the most convincing story.
Chapter 5: Shadows that Shape the Future. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, and the echoes of war faded into the rubble of a broken continent, the men of the Ghost Army vanished just as mysteriously as they had appeared. There were no parades for them, no medals pinned before cheering crowds. Their work, after all, was never meant to be seen. Their victories were illusions, and illusions are best preserved in silence. But even as the world celebrated the end of the deadliest war in human history, the legacy of these phantom soldiers was only beginning to take shape in the shadows of the next conflict, in the laboratories of intelligence agencies, and in the evolving theater of modern warfare. The Ghost Army's success had proven something extraordinary: that the human mind could be a battlefield far more powerful than any stretch of land. Their operations had demonstrated that deception, properly crafted, could save thousands of lives. The same principles that fooled German generals would soon become the foundation of Cold War espionage, propaganda, and psychological operations across the world. As Europe rebuilt, the United States and the Soviet Union began a new kind of war, one without clear front lines, fought not just with tanks and planes, but with secrets, whispers, and ideas. And in those early years, several veterans of the Ghost Army found themselves quietly recruited into America's intelligence community. They were no longer inflating rubber tanks or painting fake insignias. Instead, they were designing propaganda campaigns, studying misinformation, and crafting ways to shape what the enemy thought was real. The battlefield of the mind had been born. One of the most remarkable things about the Ghost Army was how interdisciplinary it was. It wasn't just soldiers. It was artists, sound engineers, architects, and even ad men, people who understood how humans perceive reality. That understanding became invaluable in the post-war years, as the CIA and military psychological operations units began studying how visual cues, sounds, and false narratives could alter perception on a mass scale. In a sense, the Ghost Army had proven that storytelling was a weapon. From the Pentagon's secret psychological warfare departments to Hollywood propaganda units, the lessons of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army's official name, rippled through institutions that were just learning to fight wars of perception. Their blueprints appeared in classified manuals, their techniques adapted to radio, television, and print. Some even went into Cold War operations meant to confuse or mislead Soviet spies. To most of the men who had served, this connection was invisible. They had gone home, resumed their lives, and rarely spoke of what they had done. Bill Blass, for example, became one of the most respected fashion designers of the 20th century. Ellsworth Kelly transformed into a leading figure of minimalist art. Arthur Shilstone, a wartime sketch artist, spent decades painting vivid scenes of rural America. But if you looked closely at their work, the patterns, the contrasts, the subtle manipulations of perspective, you could still see the influence of deception. The art of illusion had stayed with them. Yet not all their stories were bright. Some veterans struggled with the weight of secrecy. They had fought in one of the most unusual units of the war, risked their lives for missions that few would ever know existed,
and then been told to never speak of it. For nearly 50 years, they kept silent. Families thought they had served as ordinary engineers or radio operators. No one knew that these quiet men had once pretended to be entire divisions. It wasn't until the 1990s that the full truth began to surface. Declassified documents revealed the scale of their operations. Over 20 large-scale deceptions across Europe, saving an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 lives. The public was stunned. Historians began calling them the most creative soldiers in history. Documentaries and exhibitions emerged, but for the men themselves, it was bittersweet recognition. Too late for many, but deeply deserved. Their methods became case studies in military academies. Cadets studied how illusion could alter enemy movement, how sound and light manipulation could shape strategy. The Ghost Army had, unknowingly, created the blueprint for the modern concept of information warfare, the idea that truth, when weaponized, could be as deadly as a bomb. In one sense, their story feels almost poetic. During the darkest years of humanity's greatest conflict, it was art and imagination, not just steel and blood, that saved lives. They had turned the tools of creativity into instruments of defense, and in doing so, they blurred the line between war and performance, between survival and storytelling. Perhaps that's why their influence endures today. In an era dominated by misinformation, psychological operations, and digital deception, the Ghost Army story feels hauntingly relevant. They taught the world that reality can be shaped, that what people believe can matter more than what truly exists. But to understand the magnitude of their achievement, you have to remember the context of the time. In 1944, when they first rolled out those inflatable tanks, the world had never seen anything like it. War was supposed to be physical. Tanks, planes, bullets, men. The Ghost Army introduced something new, a battle fought entirely inside the imagination. The risks were immense. There were no guarantees. A single misstep, a soldier lighting a cigarette too close to a dummy tank, a German patrol venturing a few meters too far, could unravel everything. Yet, they operated with precision, creativity, and courage. They embodied the strange intersection between chaos and control. One former member described it perfectly years later. We were painters pretending to be warriors, and warriors pretending to be painters. We built ghosts out of canvas and air, and somehow they saved real people. As the Cold War deepened, the military's understanding of deception grew more complex. Radar jamming, decoy aircraft, false intelligence leaks, all could trace their conceptual roots back to the Ghost Army's experiments. Even in modern times, with digital warfare and cyber deception, the principle remains the same. Control what your enemy perceives, and you control the battlefield. In 2013, the Ghost Army's story finally reached the U.S. Congress, where lawmakers introduced a bill to award the unit the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. The motion recognized the men for their unique, creative, and courageous service that saved countless lives. In 2022, the recognition finally became law. Fewer than a dozen of the original soldiers lived to see it. They accepted it humbly, smiling faintly, their medals glinting like the ghosts of a long-forgotten past. It was a symbolic victory, a reminder that not all heroes carry guns, and not all wars are fought with violence. The Ghost Army's tale stands as a contradiction to the brutality of World War II. While most stories from that era are filled with death and destruction, theirs is filled with art, wit, and imagination. It's proof that humanity's capacity for creativity can shine even in the darkest times. Some say their legacy belongs in museums, others say it belongs in philosophy, but perhaps it belongs somewhere else entirely, in the realm of human courage. Because to deceive the enemy while standing unarmed within firing range takes more than intelligence. It takes nerve. It takes faith in your craft. It takes the kind of courage that can't be taught, only felt. When the last of them passes, their story will remain as a whisper in the history of war, as an echo of laughter among the ruins, as the faint hum of a recorded tank engine fading into the night. They were, and always will be, shadows who saved lives by pretending to be something more. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all, that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who never kill.
Chapter 6. The Illusion That Outlived the War. The war had ended, but the ghosts remained. For decades, their story existed only as whispers, quiet anecdotes exchanged between old men at veterans' reunions, half-forgotten sketches buried in attics, reels of film gathering dust in forgotten archives. The Ghost Army had vanished as completely as the illusions they created. In a way, that was fitting. Their entire mission had been about invisibility, to exist without being seen, to fight without being known. Even after victory, they melted back into the crowd, their names replaced by silence. But time has a way of unearthing truth. As historians dug through declassified archives, the story began to take shape. Piece by piece, like a ghost, slowly emerging from the fog, they discovered operations that defied logic. Entire phantom divisions appearing overnight on enemy maps, hundreds of speakers blasting tank sounds from empty fields, soldiers painting false insignias and spreading fake radio chatter so convincing that German intelligence units reported phantom battalions moving across France. Each illusion was a small miracle of coordination, art, and courage, and all of it had been hidden. When the documents were finally made public, it felt almost like finding a lost civilization. There, in black and white photographs, were men inflating rubber tanks in the mud, laughing as they painted shadows on the ground to make the decoys look real from above. There were sketches of fake command posts, fake bridges, even fake tire tracks, designed to fool aerial reconnaissance. The more historians uncovered, the clearer it became. This was not just a military story. It was a story about creativity, imagination, and the human spirit. The Ghost Army didn't win battles through brute force. They won them through understanding how people think, how fear, confusion, and perception shape decisions. Their work wasn't about destruction, but protection. Every successful deception meant fewer lives lost, and that might be the most poetic part of all. In a war defined by blood and fire, the Ghost Army's weapon was art. As the years passed, their legacy evolved. Universities studied their methods in courses about psychology and visual communication. Military academies analyzed their tactics as models for modern deception strategy. Artists, filmmakers, and writers drew inspiration from their story. The idea that imagination could be mightier than violence. In 2015, a documentary titled The Ghost Army premiered on PBS. For many viewers, it was the first time they'd heard of these men. Suddenly, the names that had once been hidden behind classified stamps became symbols of ingenuity. Families who had long wondered about their father's or grandfather's mysterious wartime service finally learned the truth. Some of those veterans, now in their 90s, watched the film in silence, tears in their eyes, laughter breaking through as they saw themselves young again, tricking the Nazis with rubber and sound. They had outlived the war, and now their story would outlive them. Among the many lessons they left behind, one stands above all. Reality is fragile, and imagination can change it. This idea resonates even more in the modern world. Today, wars are fought with drones, algorithms, and digital manipulation. Truth itself has become a contested battlefield. What the Ghost Army did with paint and speakers, modern powers now do with pixels and code. Yet the essence remains the same: the struggle to control what people believe. It's almost chilling to realize that the Ghost Army's experiments in illusion anticipated the 21st century's wars of perception. From deepfakes to misinformation campaigns, the ghosts of their methods still roam, shape-shifted into new forms, haunting our screens and headlines. But the difference lies in intent. The Ghost Army used deception to save lives. Today's deceptions often serve to divide or destroy, and that makes their story not just historical, but moral. It reminds us that creativity is a tool. It can illuminate or deceive, heal or harm, depending on how it's used. The men of the Ghost Army chose to use their talents for something profoundly human: protection through imagination. Their story also redefines what courage means. It's not just charging into gunfire or holding the line under attack. Sometimes courage means standing in a field with a rubber tank and a radio transmitter, knowing that if the illusion fails, you'll die unarmed. Courage means believing in an idea even when that idea seems absurd. They believed in the absurd. They made it real, and in doing so, they saved thousands. As their surviving members aged, many began receiving letters from people who had discovered their history: soldiers, artists, even children. One letter, written by a modern-day painter, said, "You taught me that art can save lives. You proved that creation can be stronger than destruction." That, perhaps, is the Ghost Army's truest victory. Not just outsmarting the enemy, but proving that human creativity, when guided by empathy, can be the most powerful weapon of all. In 2022, nearly 80 years after their first deception in France, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal. It was a moment of quiet triumph. The ceremony wasn't grand, just a handful of aging veterans surrounded by family, historians, and military officers. But in that room, something deeper resonated, a long overdue acknowledgement that imagination had changed the course of history. As the medal gleamed under the lights, one veteran leaned over and whispered, half-jokingly, "We fooled the Germans. Took us a while, but I guess we finally fooled Congress, too." The room erupted in laughter and applause. It was the perfect ending, sincere, human, and filled with the same humor that had carried them through the darkness of war. Today, as we look back, their story stands as a reminder that even in the most mechanical, destructive era of history, art found a way to matter. When technology failed, when bloodshed seemed endless, the Ghost Army proved that creativity, that most human of instincts, could still tip the balance. Theirs was not a story of power, but of perspective, not a story of violence, but of vision. And perhaps that's why it continues to haunt us, because it's a story about what it means to be human. When you walk through the fields of France or the forests of Belgium today, you won't find their monuments. There are no grand statues, no towering memorials, only silence, wind, and memory. But somewhere beneath the soil lies the echo of their laughter, the faint trace of a rubber tank, the ghost of an idea that once saved the world.